Welcome back to Sociology Droids. You ready to dive into some serious linguistic analysis with me today?
Always up for a good deep dive, especially when it comes to something as intriguing as doublespeak.
Exactly. We're tackling William Lutz's work today, his books Doublespeak and The New Doublespeak. And let me tell you, we've got a whole stack of his writing here, ready to unpack his core arguments.
Yeah, Lutz is considered a pretty pivotal figure in the study of language and how it can be, well, manipulated.
No kidding. And that's exactly what makes this deep dive so relevant, right?
Yeah.
We're going to equip you with a solid understanding of how he defines doublespeak, the different categories he lays out. Plus, we'll get into all the fascinating real-world examples he uses.
It's interesting you use the word phenomenon when you're talking about doublespeak because that's exactly how Lutz approaches it.
Oh, how so?
He doesn't just see it as like a bunch of misleading words,
Yeah.
you know. He actually identifies it as this like pattern of language use with
Wow.
very distinct characteristics, motivations.
Okay, so let's jump right in. In these texts, how does Lutz actually define doublespeak? Give us the lowdown.
He defines it as language which pretends to communicate but doesn't.
Interesting.
He goes on to say it's language that makes the bad seem good, the negative appear positive, the unpleasant appear attractive, or at least tolerable.
So it's all about intentionality, right? It's not just accidental miscommunication, it's purposeful manipulation.
Exactly. He's really focused on the intention behind the language, arguing that doublespeak is very deliberately crafted to mislead.
Okay, so we've got the definition down. But Lutz doesn't just stop there. He goes on to break down doublespeak into, like, what, 4 distinct categories, right?
Right. He outlines 4 categories.
Yeah.
Euphemisms, jargon, gobbledygook or bureaucraties, and inflated language. And he gives tons of examples for each, really dissecting how they function to obscure meaning.
Let's break those down one by one. Starting with euphemisms. We come across those all the time in daily life, but how does Lutz approach them as doublespeak?
Well, he argues that they're essentially words or phrases used to soften unpleasant realities.
Okay, so like sugarcoating the truth.
Yeah, exactly. He gives this example from the State Department in 1984. They actually replaced the word killing in their human rights reports.
No way. With what?
Unlawful or arbitrary deprivation of life.
Wow. So they're still talking about death, but the language is way less, I don't know, harsh.
Right, and that's precisely Lutz's point. He argues that while euphemisms might seem harmless on the surface, they can desensitize us to things like violence, injustice, or other negative realities.
Interesting. So it's about how language shapes our perception of reality, even if it's not directly lying.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to jargon. I feel like that one's particularly relevant for us academics, right? What does Lutz say about jargon as a doublespeak?
He definitely acknowledges that specialized language has its place, within certain fields, allows for precise communication between experts.
Sure, of course. Like, we need specific terms to talk about sociological concepts.
Right. However, Lutz emphasizes that jargon can easily become doublespeak when it's used to exclude or confuse those outside a specific group.
Makes sense. Like, if I started throwing around really obscure sociological terms with someone who's never studied sociology, it wouldn't be a very effective conversation.
Exactly. And he gives an example from the legal field, pointing out that legal jargon, while necessary for professionals, can be used to, intimidate or manipulate clients.
Because they're not familiar with the terminology.
Right. It creates this imbalance of power.
Through specialized knowledge, yeah.
Exactly. And Lutz argues that this type of jargon, even though it might sound sophisticated, is often a smokescreen.
To hide what?
To hide questionable practices or motives. He actually says jargon is the language of the insiders, and it is used to keep outsiders out and to create a sense of mystery and importance.
So it's not just about efficiency, it's about control and obfuscation. Okay, that brings us to gobbledygook, or as Lutz sometimes calls it, bureaucraties. This one always makes me think of those, official documents, the ones that are so long and complicated.
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there.
Totally. So how does Lutz define this category, and what examples does he give?
He describes gobbledygook as language that's needlessly complex, convoluted, often grammatically nonsensical.
Oof, sounds painful.
He argues that its main purpose is to just overwhelm the reader,
Yeah.
with this wall of words, ultimately obscuring the meaning and discouraging further scrutiny.
So it's like a defense mechanism.
In a way, yeah. He even includes this kind of humorous example from Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Federal Reserve.
What'd he say?
In 1988, Greenspan said, "I guess I should warn you, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I said."
That's pretty ironic.
Yeah, and Lutz points that out. He argues that this type of language is often intentionally used by those in positions of authority.
Why? To what end?
To avoid accountability and create this sense of their own importance.
So again, it's about power.
Absolutely.
Okay, last but not least, we've got inflated language. How does Lutz define that one?
He describes it as using fancy words and impressive sounding terms to make ordinary things seem extraordinary.
So it's all about appearances, making things sound more important than they actually are.
Right. He gives examples like sanitation engineer for garbage collector, customer service representative for someone who just answers phones, pre-owned vehicle for a used car.
Yeah, those are classic examples.
He argues that this type of doublespeak tries to inflate the value or importance of something, often to justify a higher price or status.
It's all about perception, isn't it?
Exactly. And Lutz suggests that while it might seem harmless, this kind of doublespeak can contribute to a culture of superficiality and a diminished value for genuine quality.
Right, because if everything is hyped up to sound amazing, then nothing really stands out. This has been a great overview of the 4 types of doublespeak that Lutz lays out. We've covered euphemisms, jargon, gobbledygook, and inflated language. But as you mentioned earlier, Lutz doesn't just define these categories, he really digs into how they play out in different parts of society. And that's what we'll be exploring next.
It's fascinating how Lutz dives into the real-world applications of doublespeak.
Yeah, totally. He doesn't just stay in the theoretical realm.
Exactly. He goes sector by sector, showing how these linguistic strategies, are used in everyday life, not just obscure academic jargon.
Right, exactly. He shows how it permeates the language we encounter daily, from the grocery store to the halls of government. Where does he start this exploration?
Well, a big chunk of his book, Doublespeak, focuses on business and economics.
Okay, interesting.
Lutz argues that corporations are masters of doublespeak, using it to, manipulate public perception, protect their image, increase profits, the whole 9 yards.
Can you give us some concrete examples of this corporate doublespeak in action?
Oh, tons. Think about layoff.
Ouch. Yeah, not a fun topic.
Instead of using straightforward terms like firing or downsizing, you get these euphemisms.
Like what?
Right sizing, streamlining, workforce optimization.
Yeah.
He also points out how companies use doublespeak to spin negative financial results.
So instead of saying we lost a ton of money.
Exactly. They'll call it a negative growth period or an earnings challenge.
It's all about putting a positive spin on things, even when the reality is, well, not so positive.
Exactly. And Lutz argues that this kind of doublespeak lets corporations avoid accountability, maintain this positive public image, even when your actions, might suggest otherwise.
So it's a way of controlling the narrative, shaping how the public perceives them.
Exactly. He actually says, corporate doublespeak is designed to make the corporation look good and to hide its mistakes, its failures, and its wrongdoing. Strong words.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. It's fascinating how he connects this type of language manipulation to power dynamics.
Right. Absolutely. He argues that doublespeak is often a tool used by those in power to, maintain the status quo, control the narrative. And this is really evident in his analysis of, politics and government.
Makes sense. If corporations are using doublespeak to maintain their power, it stands to reason that politicians would do the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does Lutz approach the use of doublespeak in the political sphere?
He's pretty critical, argues that politicians often use it to, manipulate statistics, shape public opinion, justify controversial policies. He gives a ton of examples.
Like what?
Well, the use of euphemisms like collateral damage.
To sanitize civilian deaths in war.
Right, or manipulating economic data to make the economy look better than it actually is.
So it's about controlling the message, shaping how the public perceives reality, just like with corporations.
Exactly. And Lutz argues that this kind of political doublespeak erodes public trust, makes it harder to have informed debate, ultimately undermines democratic processes.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious consequence.
He doesn't mince words. He says, political doublespeak is the enemy of clear thinking and honest discussion. It is the language of evasion, manipulation, and deception.
Let's also tackle some, pretty sensitive areas where doublespeak is used, like the military. What are some of his observations about the language used in that context?
He dedicates a good chunk of the new doublespeak to analyzing this, what he calls the Pentagon word machine.
Okay, what's that all about?
He dissects the specialized language the military uses to, obscure the realities of war.
So, like, using euphemisms to make war sound less horrific.
Exactly. He highlights examples like neutralization for killing, collateral damage for civilian casualties, and friendly fire for attacks on one's own troops.
Wow. Those are pretty stark examples.
Right. He also talks about how they use jargon and acronyms to create a sense of, distance, detachment from the human cost of war.
It's like trying to sanitize war.
Exactly. Lutz argues that this kind of doublespeak desensitizes the public to violence, making it easier to, justify military actions and downplay the consequences.
And not just war, right? He also delves into the use of doublespeak in everyday life, like advertising, education, even personal relationships.
Yeah, he covers a lot of ground.
What kind of examples does he highlight in those more, commonplace settings?
He talks about misleading food labels. Those that use terms like low-fat or sugar-free, but are still packed with unhealthy stuff.
Oh, for sure. I've fallen for those myself.
He also analyzes how inflated language is used in education. Institutions boasting about world-class facilities and innovative teaching methods when maybe the reality isn't quite so impressive.
So it's not just about big political schemes or corporate shenanigans. It's about how language is used to, nudge us in certain directions in our daily lives.
Exactly. And Lutz argues that this kind of pervasive doublespeak can really have a cumulative effect, eroding our trust, hindering critical thinking, ultimately shaping how we see the world around us.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
He writes, doublespeak is a form of mind control. It is a way of making people believe things that are not true, or of making them accept things that they would not otherwise accept.
That's a powerful statement. So we've covered how doublespeak shows up in business, politics, the military, even our everyday interactions.
Yeah, and his analysis doesn't stop at the U.S. border. He goes global.
Right, we touched on that earlier. He explores how doublespeak manifests around the world.
Yeah.
And that's what we'll delve into next. We've been laser-focused on Lutz's analysis of doublespeak in the U.S., but you mentioned earlier that he doesn't stop there.
Oh, yeah, he takes it global.
Right. He argues that doublespeak is like a worldwide phenomenon, not limited to any one country or culture.
Exactly. In the new doublespeak, he has a whole chapter called The International Language of Doublespeak.
Okay, so he's saying it's not just an American thing. It's a strategy that pops up all over the place for manipulating language to, achieve certain goals.
Right, think about it. Power dynamics, political maneuvering, even marketing. It happens everywhere.
Makes sense. What are some of the global examples of doublespeak that Lutz finds particularly, interesting?
Well, he examines a bunch of different cases, highlighting how various cultures and political systems, use doublespeak to fit their needs.
Okay, give us an example.
Right, one example he talks about is Canada Post. When they needed to cut costs, they basically resorted to doublespeak.
How so?
They described what they were doing as streamlining and enhancing services.
But they were actually.
They are closing post offices in small towns and reducing mailboxes in cities.
Sounds familiar. Kind of like the corporate doublespeak we talked about, right? Like dressing up a cost-cutting measure as something beneficial for the public.
Yeah, exactly. Lutz points out that the underlying principles of doublespeak are pretty much the same across different contexts, whether it's a government agency or a private company.
It's about using language to mask unpleasant realities, control the narrative, all that. What other examples does he give to illustrate this global reach?
He analyzes the language used by the Soviet government after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was a huge event. What did they say?
Instead of acknowledging how catastrophic it was, they used all this doublespeak, calling the explosion a rapid fuel relocation and insisting the radiation situation was stabilized.
Trying to downplay the severity through language.
Exactly. And Lutz argues that this kind of doublespeak can be really dangerous,
Yeah, I can see how it would prevent an effective response and damage public trust.
Right. He says, the language of doublespeak is often the language of denial, and denial can be deadly.
That's a powerful statement. Are there any examples from countries that have, vastly different political systems than the U.S. or Canada?
Yeah, he talks about South Africa during apartheid.
Oh, right. The system of racial segregation and oppression.
The government used doublespeak to try and make it sound less awful. more palatable. They talked about things like separate development and plural democracy.
It's scary how language can be used to justify such injustice.
Lutz's point is that doublespeak isn't bound by geography or political ideology. It's this, pervasive human tendency to manipulate language for personal or political gain.
Well, we've certainly explored the many facets of doublespeak today. From euphemisms and jargon to gobbledygook and inflated language, Lutz has given us a lot to think about.
Definitely. He provides this framework for understanding how doublespeak works, its motivations, and its consequences.
Both in the U.S. and globally. It's a reminder to be critical consumers of information, to really pay attention to the language being used around us.
Like Lutz says, we need to be aware of the language that is used to deceive us and willing to challenge it.
That's a great takeaway for our listeners. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of doublespeak. Until next time, keep those sociological lenses sharp.